Hi, I'm Pat Kiernan. This is Pat's Papers. Thanks for joining us this morning. We go through the newspaper headlines from across the country and thin them out to point you in the direction of what we find is most interesting and most relevant. Here's some of what we found today. Israel's decision on the weekend to shift to a ground attack in the Gaza Strip leads papers across the U.S. today. The L.A. Times noting that those forces have yet to enter any of Gaza's major population areas, fearing a bloody street battle with Hamas forces who know the streets better than the Israelis do. The Miami Herald has the story on the front page too, and coverage of a protest outside the Israeli consulate in Miami. USA Today says the ground assault is Israel's gamble in Gaza. The story says this phase of the offensive is much riskier than the airstrikes of last week. The New York Times with two stories on Gaza on the front page, one about the lack of diplomatic progress to end the ground attack by Israel. The other is a story about the civilian casualties in Gaza. The other big story on the front page of the New York Times is the proposal for a $300 billion tax cut. This would be part of the $800 billion economic stimulus plan favored by President-elect Barack Obama. But even optimistic Democrats don't think this package will be ready for Obama's signature on January 20th for the inauguration as they had hoped. The headline's also on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. The tax breaks for individuals and businesses are intended to win support from Republicans for Barack Obama's economic stimulus package. This is still all in the discussion stage. The story says Republicans welcome the idea of a greater percentage of a stimulus package being tax cuts rather than additional government spending. One other note about the front page of the New York Times, there is an advertisement at the bottom of page 1 of the Times today. The New York Times has traditionally reserved all of the front page for news, but today there's a CBS television advertisement. The Times comments on that in a story on page 3 of the business section. The story says this is the latest concession to the worst revenue slide for newspapers since the Depression. While we're talking about that revenue slide in the print business, there's an analysis of ad pages at major magazines this month in the New York Times today. Allure, for example, had 70 ad pages at this time last year, just 41 in the magazine this year. Wired, Architectural Digest, Vogue, and Lucky had similar ad declines. Today's Chicago Tribune says it was an emotional President-elect Barack Obama who left his Chicago home yesterday for his new job in Washington. Obama said to reporters on his plane flying to D.C., "I gotta say I choked up a little bit leaving my house today." A friend of his daughter, Malia, had dropped off an album full of pictures. They had been friends since preschool. Of course, now they won't see much of each other, with the Obama girls starting at their new school in D.C. The recount in Minnesota Senate race is over, but the Pioneer Press today says it's not really over. The recount ends with a 225-vote lead for Al Franken, but the story says defeated veteran Norm Coleman's team has been intensely discussing an election lawsuit, though the story says expense and fear of a public backlash could lead Coleman to just accept the determination that his Democratic challenger won. A story that hit over the weekend, still getting a lot of play on the front pages of New York's tabloids, the Daily News and the New York Post, with photos of actor John Travolta with his kids. His seizure-prone 16-year-old son, Jet, died Friday morning in the Bahamas. The New York Post headline tells of a desperate ambulance ride as Travolta and his wife Kelly Preston begged their son to hang on until he could get to doctors. The number of homeschooled children in the U.S. is rising. A front-page story in USA Today includes a survey of parents. 88% of parents who homeschool say they do so in part because of concerns about safety, drugs, or peer pressure at a traditional school. My favorite story of the day, this one from the Washington Post. The headline is "A Moment of Tooth." It's about advances in science that will soon allow us to regrow worn-out teeth. Unfortunately, this story contains some bad news for me and maybe for you. I did what my dentist told me and had all my wisdom teeth removed. Turns out those wisdom teeth would have been the ideal source of stem cells, which would be used to grow any necessary new teeth. This is still a few years away before we start growing our own teeth. A lot of papers picking up on an Associated Press story about 79-year-old Donald Peters, as published in the Philadelphia Inquirer. He bought a lottery ticket the day he died. He ended up a $10 million winner. His wife of 59 years, Charlotte, cashed in the ticket on Friday. The Peters children think their father would have appreciated the irony. The Boston Herald, among the papers picking up on George H.W. Bush's interview yesterday. He told Fox News Sunday he would like to see his second son, Jeb, be president too. When asked if he was serious, he admitted, "Right now is probably a bad time." Also from Boston, we've heard so much about lower mortgage rates. That is true of smaller mortgages, but what if you need what the banks know as a jumbo loan? Your rate, quote, will likely be much higher. A story in the Boston Herald says jumbo loans are still in the 7% range. It's a particular concern in areas like Boston with higher housing prices, many house prices well above the $417,000 cap for the more affordable conventional mortgage. Finally, the Reading Eagle with a particularly detailed front page story about counterfeit money. The headline is Know Your Money. Investigators say it's become so easy to print something resembling money on your computer that the main defense to counterfeiting really is now public education. There are detailed tips to help you spot a fake bill. The story says it used to be that investigators would follow the trail of industrial-strength printing equipment to find counterfeiters, but now 90% of counterfeit money comes from an ordinary computer scanner and color printer. And that's a look at just some of what's in the newspapers this morning. We try to pick the highlights for you each day, but if you think there's a particular story we should have included, send us a comment. You can do that at patspapers.com, and there you will find links to the individual newspaper websites where you can read these stories in their entirety.